The most disturbing part of this story isn't that 5 men vanished without a trace in the Pacific Ocean. It's that one of them was found buried 2,000 miles away by someone who was never supposed to be there. Viewer discretion is advised. But before we dive into today's maritime mystery, if you enjoy unexplained disappearances and unsolved cases, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss our new uploads. We upload new videos 2 to 3 times every week. Now let's begin. February 11th, 1979 dawned as what locals in Hana, Maui would later describe as a perfect morning for fishing. The sea was calm, the sky was clear, and 5 young men from the tight-knit Hawaiian community were about to embark on what should have been a routine day trip. Ralph Maliakini, 27, had borrowed his brother's boat, a 17-foot Boston whaler called the Sarah Joe, named after their parents. He was joined by his close friends, Scott Mormon, 27, a California transplant who had fallen in love with island life, Benjamin Kalama, 38, known locally as Benny, Patrick Wessner, 26, and Peter Hanchett, 31. These weren't inexperienced weekend warriors. Between them, they had over 50 years of marine experience, including swimming, surfing, diving, and paddling in Hawaiian waters. The men had decided to skip work at a nearby construction site to take advantage of the beautiful weather. Without many supplies, they piled into the small craft with its 85-horsepower engine and set out mid-morning from Hana Bay Boat Ramp. Their plan was simple: spend a day fishing and return before dark. It was the kind of spontaneous adventure that epitomized the laid-back island lifestyle they all cherished. None of them could have imagined that they were embarking on a journey that would become one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in Pacific history. By 1 p.m., the perfect morning had transformed into something far more sinister. The wind increased rapidly to gale force, and what had started as gentle swells became towering walls of water. The Alan-Waihaha Channel, which separates Maui from the Big Island, is notorious among mariners as one of the roughest waterways in the world, where trade winds accelerate between the islands and create treacherous conditions with little warning. By evening, the storm had reached what witnesses would later describe as chaos. 40-foot waves and winds of 30 to 40 knots that turned the ocean into a washing machine of white water and fury. Ulu Helikahi, Ralph Maliakini's wife, found herself standing on Hana Pier that afternoon, searching the horizon for any sign of the Sarah Joe. As the hours passed and the weather worsened, her concern turned to panic. She called the police that afternoon, and the U.S. Coast Guard was immediately notified. That night, despite the dangerous conditions, a group of Hana men took larger boats out to search for their missing friends. Some reported their vessels going vertical in the massive waves, a testament to just how severe the storm had become. The Coast Guard launched one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in Hawaiian history. For 5 days, aircraft and vessels scoured over 70,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean, covering an area larger than the state of Florida. They searched the waters around Maui, the Big Island, and even extended their efforts to the outer islands. When the official search was called off, the Hana community refused to give up. A massive volunteer effort ensued, with people combing coastlines, flying private aircraft, and organizing boat searches. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there was no trace of the Sarah Joe or her crew. The families were left in an agonizing limbo. Without bodies or wreckage, there was no closure, no answers, only the terrible uncertainty of not knowing. The Sarah Joe had simply vanished, as if the ocean had swallowed it whole. For nearly a decade, the case remained one of Hawaii's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The families held on to hope, but as the years passed, that hope began to fade. And then, in 1988, something extraordinary happened that would reopen the case and create even more questions than it answered. Marine biologist John Naughton was conducting research on Tangi Atoll, a remote and uninhabited coral atoll in the northern Marshall Islands, approximately 2,200 miles southwest of Hawaii. Tangi, also known as Bokak Atoll, is one of the most isolated places on Earth, a tiny ring of coral and sand in the vast Pacific, visited only occasionally by scientists and illegal fishing vessels. As Naughton surveyed the atoll, something caught his eye on the beach. The unmistakable hull of a small boat, battered and weathered but still recognizable. When he approached the wreckage, Naughton's heart began to race. On the hull, he could make out a Hawaii registry number. Having participated in the original search for the Sarah Joe nearly a decade earlier, he immediately thought of the missing vessel. But the possibility seemed almost impossible to believe. How could a 17-foot boat travel over 2,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean and end up on this remote atoll? The discovery was confirmed. It was indeed the Sarah Joe, but this revelation only deepened the mystery. Near the boat wreckage, Naughton made an even more startling discovery: a crude grave marked by a cross made from driftwood. The grave was covered with stones and appeared to have been there for several years. Inside, investigators would later find human remains that dental records confirmed belonged to Scott Moorman. But the grave itself told a story that defied explanation. Alongside the remains were items that seemed completely out of place. Blank notepaper interleaved with aluminum foil, materials that had no connection to the missing fishermen or their boat. The presence of these items suggested something that investigators found deeply unsettling. Someone else had found Scott Moorman's body and buried it according to what appeared to be Chinese or Taiwanese funeral customs. In some Asian cultures, paper money and foil are placed with the dead to ensure good fortune in the afterlife. But the driftwood cross was distinctly Christian, creating a bizarre fusion of burial traditions that pointed to a mystery within a mystery. The official theory that emerged was both logical and deeply troubling. Investigators believed that illegal Taiwanese or Chinese fishing vessels, operating far from their home waters to avoid detection, had discovered Moorman's remains, possibly washed ashore or found with wreckage from the Sarah Joe. Rather than report the discovery to authorities, which would have exposed their illegal fishing operations and potentially resulted in arrest and prosecution, they chose to bury the body according to their cultural traditions and continue on their way. This theory explained the presence of the paper and foil, as well as the secretive nature of the burial. But it raised disturbing questions about what had happened to the other four men. If Scott Moorman had made it to Tangi Atoll, either alive or dead, where were Ralph Maliakini, Benjamin Kalama, Patrick Wessner, and Peter Hanchett? Had they all perished during the storm, with only Moorman's body making the incredible journey across the Pacific? Or had some of them survived the initial disaster, only to die later on the remote atoll? In 1990, Ralph Maliakini's brother Robert, along with private investigator Steve Goodenow and TV host Hari Kojima, traveled to Tangi Atoll to conduct their own investigation. What they found was both heartbreaking and mystifying. The atoll was indeed uninhabited and inhospitable, a place where survival would be nearly impossible without supplies and rescue. Robert Maliakini later said that seeing the remote location convinced him that the journey would have been too difficult to survive, even for experienced watermen like his brother and friends. The investigators found no trace of the other four men, no additional graves, no evidence that anyone had lived on the atoll for an extended period. This absence of evidence became evidence itself, suggesting that if the men had made it to Tangi, they had not survived long enough to establish any kind of permanent presence. The harsh reality was that the atoll, while providing temporary shelter, offered no fresh water, no food sources, and no means of signaling for rescue. But how did the Sarah Joe travel over 2,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean? Ocean current experts have studied this question extensively, and their findings suggest that it's not only possible, but somewhat predictable. The North Pacific Gyre, a massive system of rotating ocean currents, could have carried the boat and any debris from the original storm site near Hawaii westward across the Pacific. Computer models show that objects caught in these currents can travel thousands of miles over the course of several years, eventually washing up on remote atolls and islands throughout the Pacific. What makes this case particularly haunting is the timeline. The storm occurred in February 1979, but Scott Moorman's grave appeared to have been made several years later, suggesting that either his body had been preserved by the ocean and currents for an extended period, or that he had somehow survived the initial disaster and lived for some time before dying and being discovered by the illegal fishermen. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exactly when death had occurred, leaving this crucial question unanswered. The discovery of Scott Moorman's grave brought both closure and renewed anguish to the families. Patricia Moorman, Scott's mother, expressed relief that her son was no longer lost in the ocean someplace. But the discovery also intensified the pain for the other families, who were left wondering if their loved ones might also be found someday, somewhere in the vast Pacific. The Sarah Jo case became a symbol of both the ocean's power to destroy and its ability to preserve mysteries across time and distance. Today, more than 4 decades after that fateful February morning, the fate of Ralph Maliakini, Benjamin Kalama, Patrick Wessner, and Peter Hanchett remains unknown. Their families have never received the closure that Scott Moorman's family found, however bittersweet it may have been. The Sarah Jo mystery stands as a reminder of how quickly the familiar can become unfathomable, how the ocean can swallow lives and secrets, carrying them thousands of miles from home to places where they may never be found. In the end, the Sarah Jo case forces us to confront the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and our own insignificance within it. 5 men set out on a perfect morning for what should have been a simple day of fishing, and only one would ever be found, buried by strangers on a remote atoll, marked by a cross made of driftwood and surrounded by the endless blue of the Pacific. The ocean had taken them far from home, but it had also, in its mysterious way, ensured that at least one of them would not be forgotten. The Sarah Jo reminds us that some mysteries are larger than our ability to solve them, and that sometimes the questions we cannot answer are more powerful than any truth we might discover.